Okay, good morning, everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. We're going to start in 2 minutes. We have quorum, so sorry for the delay this morning, and we'll be starting shortly. Okay, off we go. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Built Heritage Subcommittee. So going through the agenda, we have one regret from Councillor Moffat, who wasn't able to be here this morning. Any declarations of interest?
Yes, I have a declaration of interest on 600 Minto Place application.
Okay, thank you very much. Confirmation of minutes from the 10th of December meeting 2015. Are those carried? Carried. Great. Okay, so we're going to go through the consent agenda first, because I think there are at least a couple of items that we'll be able to deal with that way, and then we'll come back to the items that will be held. So to start with, we have the demolition of 171 Bruyere Street, a property designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act. So I believe we have a motion from the Vice Chair to defer this item to the next meeting. Mr. Vice Chair?
Yes, at the request of Ottawa Community Housing, I'm moving to defer this item to the next meeting to allow Ottawa Community Housing to look at options, viable options with the Infrastructure Ontario.
Is that motion carried? Carried. Okay, so that item will be deferred until the next meeting. Item 2 is the Rockcliffe Park Heritage Conservation District Plan. We're going to hold that item. Okay, so item 3 is the designation of the Llewellyn House, 5897 Fernbank, and we have delegations signed up, so we will hold that item as well. Item 4 is a status update. Is that received? Yes, received. Great. So that is done. Item 5 is the new Edinburgh Heritage Conservation District Plan. We're going to hold that item because we have a short presentation from staff. Item 6 is the application to alter 122 Daly Avenue. This is an item that was before the committee back in 2015 and which has come back. I'm in the committee's hands if committees would like to hold this item, or can this be carried? This item carried? Carried. Okay, great. Item 7 is 600 Minto Place. I see Vice Chair Podolsky has left the table. Can this item be carried? Carried. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So that is looked after. And then the other items we will come back to at the end of the meeting. Okay, so moving back then to the items held. We'll start with the Rockcliffe Park Heritage Conservation District Plan. So as members will recall, we had a full discussion on this item at the last meeting, and at the end of it, I undertook to undertake consultations with the Rockcliffe Park Residents Association and other interested parties on addressing some of the issues which were raised at our previous meeting in the plan. And so after many meetings and conversations on that, I put forward a draft motion yesterday, which I circulated to members, which addresses many of the concerns raised by the RPRA. There are two caveats to the motion which the Vice Chair will be putting forward on this item. The first is the motion, because it was done a little bit towards the end of the day yesterday, will require some additional scrubbing. These are small language changes which will need to be addressed either for legal certainty or to address other small issues which weren't fully captured in the motion. So that's the first category, and if the committee agrees to pass the motion, I will undertake to make those small scrubbing changes between now and Planning Committee next week, and be sure that members have a copy of the amended motion before it goes to Planning. So that's category one. The other category of items is we weren't able to address over the course of the previous weeks. One issue that's come up where there have been concerns about scoring, concerns about the concept in the plan about contributing, non-contributing. That was an item that was large enough that I felt it was not appropriate to try and quickly deal with that issue at this meeting. So if the committee agrees, the proposal that I would put forward is that we, again, if it meets the agreement of this group, that we pass the plan with the amended motion, recognizing that we will need to come back over the course of 2016 in order to address this more fundamental issue, which will require greater consultation and so on. It's not enough to frustrate the execution of this plan. It's not enough to want us to defer approval of this. It's just I want to make sure that you have an understanding that this is an item that will come back to the committee on when I feel it is ready to come back over the course of 2016. And at that time, if the committee approves that and council does, at that point we can address the bylaws, amend the bylaws, and execute the actual plan, which, if it's approved by council at the end of the month, will be in force, but won't be reflected through the bylaws until such time as we've fixed these problems I'm mentioning, and then we'll do a single execution of the zoning bylaw. So that's the proposed course of action. Just to explain a little bit what's happened between the meeting we had at the beginning of December and now. And so with that, I'm happy to, well, I guess the first question is whether we have speakers, and maybe we'll let the speakers go first. We also have a letter that was circulated, which I can address in a moment. But why don't we go to our speakers list first, and then we can have questions and comments to staff afterwards. So the first speaker on the list is Brian Dixon from the Rockcliffe Park Residents Association.
This one?
This one?
Yes, and bring it close to you.
One, two, three. Is everybody here?
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for providing the opportunity for me to speak this morning. My name is Brian Dixon. I'm a founding member of the Rockcliffe Park Residents Association and have been its president for the past 6 years. Because I spent some time at the last meeting of this subcommittee on the history of Rockcliffe, I will briefly summarize the main points. Rockcliffe is a unique, historic, and an extremely rare community. Founded pre-Confederation in 1864, there are only 3 early park-like communities, such as our own, that survive in North America. We are the only one in Canada. Until amalgamation with the city 15 years ago, Rockcliffe, through its village council, successfully controlled its own development. The RPRA carries on this long-standing tradition with a broad membership of local residents. With amalgamation and a trend toward bigger and bigger houses, the challenge has become much greater. Our current framework for protection of our Heritage Conservation District, which is the Rockcliffe Park part of the official plan, and the heritage conservation guidelines have proven inadequate. First, in preventing the construction of monster homes that overwhelm their lots and their neighbors. Second, in protecting larger lots and safeguarding the mix of smaller and larger lots. Third, in maintaining the established heritage character of Rockcliffe with respect to setbacks and alignment. And finally, in dealing with the issue of rooftop terraces. Since the last meeting of the subcommittee, we have worked with Councillor Nussbaum and city staff on a draft motion, which Councillor Nussbaum has just mentioned, and I quote from its preamble, to provide further clarity and specificity to ensure appropriate and enforceable protection for the heritage attributes of the district. That's the end of quote. This draft motion is before you today, and we believe that we have made substantial progress in providing such clarity and specificity. Although, as Councillor Nussbaum has just mentioned, through the two caveats which he described, there is still a little bit of adjustment work to be done on the text prior to the next meeting of Planning Committee, and then a somewhat longer-term project on the issue of contributing and non-contributing properties, including the scoring of those properties. So, in short, we thank Councillor Nussbaum, Sally Coots, and the Heritage Committee of the Rockcliffe Park Residents Association for the tremendous amount of work they have put into this initiative. Our objective is to get a new plan in place as soon as possible. I would therefore ask the subcommittee to support the draft plan and the proposed motion, subject to the two caveats that Councillor Nussbaum has mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for the speaker? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't believe there are any other speakers who wanted to speak this morning, so with that, I open up the floor for comments or questions. Member Smallwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up a little bit on what Brian said, the issue about the contributing versus non-contributing is really important. It's not just a technical thing of deciding whether a house should be in or not. It gets at the fundamental reason for the designation of the village. The Rockcliffe, as Brian had mentioned, there's only 3 communities like this in North America, and only one in Canada. The only other one that comes close is Witchwood in Toronto, which was designed by Eden Smith. The idea of these communities was that in many heritage districts, what we look at as the importance is the bricks and mortar. We're looking at the building, the architectural style. In this community, what we're looking at is the landscape and the sense of, if I can use the analogy of often and with houses, you see the garage is prominent, you see the garage first, and then you see the house, and people are concerned about that. In this case, what you should see is the landscape first, and then the house. So the hierarchy of vision as you go through the community should be one of meandering roads with a rural type setting. And this is unusual, and it is why it was called Rockcliffe Park. But it is the sort of thing that is difficult sometimes when you're looking at a very narrow set of definitions on a particular property. You sometimes miss the sense of the bigger community, which is what we're looking at here. In fact, it's interesting, when there was a movie that was filmed, and when the producers were looking for a location to film that movie, in all of North America, they picked Rockcliffe Park. And the reason they picked it was because of the streetscape, that shared vision, the shared property that goes down the street, where you see not the houses protruding out, but you see landscape, and you have that continuous vision of landscape. And that is what's really important, and I think that we can't lose sight of that in this process. All of the other things should fall underneath the basic understanding that we're not dealing with a typical district here. This is not a bricks and mortar district. This is a district where the green space is primary. So I would just ask that in this process, as we go forward, we not lose sight of that, because I think that is what is really critical in the and in fact, one of the things that is in the report, it states right in note and point 1 in the introduction, The previous, when the Heritage Conservation District was done, there was deliberately no building-by-building analysis. In other words, it wasn't, does this building contribute or not? All of them contribute because it's the landscape that's contributing. So to some degree or another, they all contribute. And that is the concern I have about having this, suggesting that some of them don't contribute. They all do because it's the landscape that's the issue here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that comment. And as you noted, that is something that will be addressed, those sorts of questions in that part two of the review. Any other questions or comments? Member Quinn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Only to say that I support Member Smallwood's position. I think that getting clarity around this is really important, as the non-contributing, what is being defined now as non-contributing is making up a significant portion, I think close to 70% of the village's building stock. So just to reiterate Member Smallwood's point. Yeah.
Great. Mr. Vice Chair.
I think Sandy's comments have hit on a point where and I do support, the motion that to adopt, and also the motion to clarify, which I'll be advancing. But I think that in some ways, the whole question of how we score the individual houses, how the houses in Rockcliffe Heritage Conservation District make up or don't make up its essential heritage character. There's applications here for other heritage districts as well. And I think that in some ways we have gone ahead with scoring changes in the city that has been ahead of the curve. The public and communities haven't really been able to follow it yet. And so I think that the work that is done in the next 4, 5, 6 months to come up with clarifications, I think will benefit the whole city and the other districts as well.
Great. Councillor Wilkinson?
I agree with all of that. I think we're working on some in my area which has, it's more of a, if I can call it average housing as opposed to Rockcliffe Park, but the concept of the whole community is so important, and it's got a very distinct thing which not all communities have. So I think that characteristic is very important here. I did want to ask about the letter we have from Fulton about a particular property that we have already approved, but because it's going through various legal channels, may run out of time, and I would think that things that are already in the process would be still in the process. I wouldn't make them go back to square one. Is that the case? Is that really what they're asking for here?
I can speak to that a little bit, and then legal is welcome to chime in. So as a result of the question asked by the property owner at the previous meeting, legal counsel issued a memorandum last week, and the essence of it essentially is that although legal was not recommending a exemption to the property, they did clarify that should this committee want to recommend to council, should the decision of the OMB occur after the expiry of the heritage permit, meaning in a situation where the appeal fails and the decision of the OMB or the timing is such that the applicant can't draw a building permit because the heritage permit has expired, it would be within the rights of this committee to recommend to council that an exemption through a time period, exemption is not the right word, that the actual permits could be extended to allow the applicant to draw the building permit if in fact we are in a situation where the timing of the OMB does not permit.
If the approval is such that what we approved originally is still in place, that we would recommend that we extend the period of the permit. Can that be done now? Can they be given an extra 6 months now just to make sure they have some time, or not?
Well, the issue is we may not have a problem. So if the decision of the OMB comes down in the next couple of months, say, and the appeal fails, then
they can go ahead.
Then it won't be a problem. So the decision based on speaking to actual legal counsel on this is until such time as we know this is an issue, there isn't a need to address it. if it does become an issue, I mean, I've certainly shared my view, and I think it's the view of most people involved in this, that nobody expects double jeopardy. So it's clear in legal terms that if the appeal fails, that the applicant is working under the rules at the time of the application. So with that
and
understanding...
legally, that's, I mean, if we turned them down at that point, they could go back to court and overturn us too, and it gets very messy. So as long as we can give that assurance, I agree with you on that. That's the way I would look at it.
Is there anything that you would like to add from the legal side? Samantha?
No, that accurately captures the discussions we've had with the applicant, and the applicant understands that as well as the applicant's legal counsel.
Okay. With that, I'm going to ask the Vice Chair to introduce the motion. It's on the screen, so in order to save 15 minutes or so, I don't think there's a need to read out the substance, but perhaps, Mr. Vice Chair, you can introduce the motion.
It's not on the screen yet.
And the other point of it is
Okay.
that's how you check on minutes. We don't really
I'm at the disposal of the chair and the legal, but if it's to be read orally, I will do it, and hope I don't bore you.
I mean, I guess the question is, can we
question is that
can we
because our
read in
minutes are
the
now-
motion in the oral minutes in order to, so that the public understand what the motion was? Is that possible, Samantha?
You have a fair amount of discretion here, Mr. Chair, because the motion is up on the screen. So I can't really advise you one way or the other. If you would like to have it formally read into the record, that's
All right, we will explore that. I mean,
What if the written report that comes here would have the whole motion in it, would it?
That's right.
Because
Yes,
one of
it
the
would.
problems we sometimes have at council is people don't want to read the whole thing to save time, but the people on air listening to it haven't a clue what we're doing, and that's not really very open to the public.
What we will ensure is that in some form in either the report or the minutes, the full text of the motion is contained. I mean, I can say as a matter of introduction that the purpose really of the motion was to clarify a number of issues where there was a lack of legal clarity. It was to provide greater certainty on issues. I would just identify issues about lots and lot sizes, about corner lots, about issues about new buildings and the way that they fit into the actual Heritage Conservation District. It's all language that played on existing language amendments to them. And so the motion is available to members and will be made available to the public too. And after it's read out, if it's adopted, then that will be a public document as part of the report passing. Yeah. Mr. Vice Chair.
I would like to make this motion, and I just hope that there's no demand for me to read the 3 pages. It's not all that entertaining, but it's very important in the language. So moved.
So on the motion, is the motion carried? Carried. And so therefore, is the report with the motion as amended carried? Carried. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for staying with me on that item. It was a little bit complicated, but I think we found a route forward. So I want to turn now to the next item, which is the designation of the Llewellyn House at 5897 Fernbank Road. Members will recall that we deferred this item from the last meeting because we wanted to give staff the opportunity to work with the applicant. Councillor Wilkinson has a motion amending the report which came before us at the last meeting, and I think it would be useful, Councillor Wilkinson, just to read out the substantive portion. Then we'll open up the discussion. I know we have speakers on the list, but I think it's important for members to hear what the purpose of the motion is. So, Councillor Wilkinson.
I'll do that, Mr. Chair. And this has been it's in Shad Kadri's ward, and he has agreed with this change. It's to make it more. So I won't go through the whereases, but it's that they resolved that they recommend to the Planning Committee that they remove the apple orchard from the list of heritage attributes to the statement of cultural heritage values attached to document 5 to the report, acknowledge the cultural heritage value of the apple orchard, and direct staff to work with the property owners to retain and incorporate as much of the orchard as possible through the development review process, and direct staff to work with the new property owner to assess the condition of the building, and if a new foundation is required, the potential relocation of the building on the site. And the reason, Mr. Chair, just to say why we're doing this is in an area which is now in the urban area and subject to urban subdivisions, and it's to try to make sure we've maintained that house in that subdivision in a way that it will be there forever.
Okay, thank you for reading that out. We won't deal with the motion now. We'll turn now to the public speakers, and then we can have a conversation and questions either on the report or on the motion thereafter from members. So the first person on the list of public delegations is Terry Kelly. Good morning, Mr. Kelly. Welcome. You have 5 minutes to speak, and welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and present to the subcommittee. My name is Terry Kelly. I'm the son-in-law of the owner, Dorothy Jones, and my wife and I will be speaking separately on behalf of Dorothy. My goal is to provide a different perspective on the information that is available to you as a subcommittee, so that your decision will be well informed. I will highlight information from our written submission, which was composed by my wife Susan and myself, and which addresses the staff evaluation survey, which was attached to your report as document 4. We are asking that the subcommittee not recommend designation because even by its own criteria, it is a very weak candidate for heritage property. I'd like to just highlight some of the reasons I make that suggestion. Under the design and physical value criterion, it is true, of course, that it architecturally represents a Gothic revival style. But as stated in the staff report, it is not rare, it is not unique, there is no merit in the craftsmanship, and there is no technical merit. In short, it generally represents an architectural style that currently exists in and around the Ottawa area. To the second criteria, which is historical and associative value, the report provides a short, colorful narrative that describes the activities of a family who resided on and in the property for several decades. But the list or the test of community history is that the property yields valuable or potentially yield valuable information to understand and retain the historic past. The staff determined that it did, and we would suggest that it does not. And the reason for that is the verb is critical. The verb is yields. And we do not understand how it is that the current structure would yield potential valuable information to understand the past and the future. We do believe it represents, we do not believe it yields new information for the future. Under the title Community Character, the report emphasizes its agricultural use, yet no agricultural activities have been conducted on this property for well over a half a century. The property has been repeatedly compromised, most currently by the City of Ottawa, who used half of the property to build a road and a traffic circle. There is no remaining link on the property to the agricultural activities, and I emphasize on the property because directly across the street from the property and extending all along the south side of Fallowfield is a continuous and a thriving agricultural use of the area. I have particular concern with the report's conclusion that this is one of the few remaining, that's a quote, one of the few remaining buildings in this area of this era. I suggest to you that this is a subjective and a qualitative statement, which I was surprised to see in a purportedly technical report. The maps within the report show that there are other such buildings from that era in the area. The sentence that's constructed is confined to what was previously the Goulburn Township, and we believe would be disproved if we considered other buildings, other properties within and around Ottawa. I guess what I'm saying is not believe that we don't believe there is an accurate survey of buildings of this area in and around the Ottawa area. And therefore, we do not believe that this property objectively meets the criterion that it retains the area's historical agricultural character. We believe it does not. In summary, at best, we feel it's a very weak case that has been made for a designation of heritage property. Although the report is structured around criteria, the analysis and information reads more like an essay than a technical report. And I do not mean, and I really want to emphasize this, I do not mean this in a disparaging way. I believe that the strongest case possible has been made for designation. However, I suggest it's an extremely tenuous discussion. And I'm concerned that an important decision will be made based on that type of information. I would just ask. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. If you can just stay for a moment because there are questions from members.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilkinson.
Now, you're speaking for the owner, you said, the property owner now.
I'm representing in part, yes.
Yeah. If the house was not designated, what would you do with it?
The current plan is that the house will be sold and that the current the people who have made the offer are intending to keep the structure and develop it.
Develop it how?
Sorry, and use it in a commercial way as a, I'm sorry, I don't know all the details exactly, but it is being used, it is intended to be used as a wellness area, and therefore the structure, the external portions will be retained, and it will be maintained as part of the community.
Why are you upset about designated heritage? It won't make any difference. They can still use it.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Well, if it's designated heritage, it would not stop that from happening. If it's not designated heritage, it runs the risk of being taken down, and that's, I think, what we're concerned about here. I know there are a few other houses similar to that around, but I know it's been done before. We have many subdivisions in the PN and Canada where the original farmhouses that were from the 19th century were retained on a building lot. And we've said under this motion that I put forward that if necessary it could in fact be moved so that you can have a way of making sure that it fits well into the other development. Is that going to be a problem with you?
I don't have sufficient information to be able to give you a complete answer to that. So I do know that the next speaker is my wife, who I think has spent more time with the potential purchaser, and therefore probably can give you better information on that.
Okay, I'll wait for that then. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Quinn? Or, no. Vice Chair?
A question for Mr. Kelly. You have reviewed the criteria for evaluation and the scoring of the heritage attributes and the staff's conclusions, and you've suggested that they are subjective. And I think one of the things that, in the whole heritage conservation program in Ontario, that there's a very scrupulous attempt through the legislation to try to be objective in the criteria and the evaluations. And one of the things that emerges here is that I just have to ask you, have you asked an independent heritage consultant to give a second opinion on the staff analysis and the staff recommendation? Because that would be a way that your case would be quite convincing if somebody that is scholarly and respected actually challenged the criteria, rather than it being, in my opinion. So did you do that? Did you get a heritage consultant to do that and prepare a report for you?
To my knowledge, that has not taken place. And if I could also just add to your comment, when I made the reference to a subjective, it was very specific to the last in summary, and there was one sentence that asserted something which I tried to suggest had information that the only way that that sentence could be held to be credible was based on information that either wasn't there and therefore was somewhat subjective in its conclusion. I did not mean to suggest that the criteria or any other aspects of the survey that we looked at was indeed subjective, and really most of what I was trying to present very quickly, and I hope you find better presented in our 4-page written submission, actually goes to the points of these are the criteria that you have defined, and this is the way we understand them to be applied and understood. But I appreciate your question. No, as far as I know, we did not go to an independent assessment.
Okay. Seeing no more questions, Mr. Councillor Carter, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And just a question to Mr. Kelly. You just mentioned that in the property itself has been affected by the city over time frame. Could you just give us a little background onto that?
Yes, and again, I do know that my wife will also be presenting on that, but just as quick information would be that specifically, which has just been in the last 2 years, the city determined that they wished to create a traffic circle and that would rearrange basically the roads, and to that effect they needed to basically acquire approximately 5 acres from what was then previously 10 acres of the property, and that was acquired, and subsequently there has been a traffic circle and a new road created, most of which came from this particular property, which is now being designated because of its agricultural value and its past use.
Second question, just supplemental to Vice Chair's question. In terms of the staff or city representative, did they come and see you before they talked about designating your property to heritage?
No.
Did you have an input into that?
We were not aware that it was being considered for designation. We became aware of it when the prospective purchaser was doing diligence and identified that indeed there is some consideration taking place. Subsequently, we did meet, and actually we were very open towards bringing staff onto the property so they could inspect it and see it. So we became aware of it through other circumstances, but subsequently I think we've worked quite closely with them really to make sure they had the information that we had, and they've been forthcoming with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much,
Thank
Mr.
you very
Kelly.
much. If you don't mind, I'm just going to leave this document here because somebody else will be referring to it in a second.
Sure.
And she told me I'd probably forget to give it to her, so now I'm going to make sure. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Right. So the next person on the list is Susan Kelly, followed by Jen Hassani. Good morning and welcome. You have 5 minutes.
Can you just wait for a second? I'm waiting for this to go up. Yes, please. I am not technically adept. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. My name is Susan Kelly. I'm Dorothy Jones's daughter. My mother is almost 98 years old, and so for her to come here and speak would be very challenging. She's greatly upset by this whole process. My parents bought the property. It was originally 200 acres, and my parents bought a small portion, 10 acres. It was severed in 1962. And over the course of 30 years, they lovingly renovated the house, and until my father's death in 1992, at which point my mother no longer had the resources. The house is now in terrible condition. Pretty well everything needs to be replaced, and we have buyers now who are really, really interested in renovating the house. You asked about if there was an implication. Yes, there is a financial implication, a significant financial implication to my mother if this is designated. And if the orchard is designated, it basically means everything stops. The buyer walks. And so we're gravely, gravely concerned about this. The house has been up for sale for 1.5 years. It has issues. It needs roof, it needs electrical, it needs water, it needs new chimneys. It's got a compromised foundation. It's got water infiltration throughout the house, and all the stone needs repointing. It needs love, and my mother simply hasn't got the resources to do it. We finally have buyers who are thinking about developing this or planning to develop this as a PTSD wellness center. What better thing could we do than that? I think it's absolutely incredible idea. And by putting a heritage designation on it, it just adds a whole bunch of extra steps. And it just seems to me we could all get what we want, the renovation of the house, without the formal designation. one can argue that the historical designation is more important than, say, the rights of a property owner. And normally I would agree with you. But over the course of 30 years, you see that line that goes across that diagram? That's a hydro line. That went in the mid-'80s. The reason it was put in on that property, it was supposed to go between Flewellen and Fernbank. It was put there explicitly because that property was no longer in agricultural production. Then, as my husband said, in 2014, they put the traffic circle and the roadway through my mother's property. So it's essentially negotiate, Mrs. Jones, or we expropriate twice. And now you come along, just as she's at the point of selling her property, and it's another incursion by the state. And quite frankly, we'd really appreciate it if you step back. None of these changes on Fernbank Road were the result of my mother's activity. These are all other decisions, and yet my mother's property is being held as an example of agricultural heritage when it hasn't been used as such for over 50 years. In our view, the house is not a strong candidate for heritage designated. It's not visible. Somewhere it says in the report that it used to be visible. No, it didn't. I've known that property for 50 years, and there were always a lot of trees around it. It's on a traffic circle. People are not going to stop and look at a house when they're going around a traffic circle. Its claim to fame was people that lived there a long time. That is not of tremendous historical value, and the value of the Flewellen family has already been recognized in the naming of the old former 9th line. There's several other stone houses. I can name 3 that aren't on that map, and throughout the Ottawa area there's many more. The agricultural past, as I said, the reason they put the hydro lines is because it was no longer being used for agricultural purposes. And there's active farming on the south side of Fernbank Road. As I say, my main concern is the fact that the state is incurred on this little 10-acre property twice to a huge extent, and now, just as my mother's selling it, it's a 3rd time. I would ask you to reconsider. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, Ms. Kelly. Any questions from committee members? Councillor Wilkinson.
Why does the purchaser think this is going to mean that they can't do what they're going to do? It wouldn't make any difference.
I'm sorry?
You said that they won't buy it if it's designated heritage. That doesn't make any difference to what they could do for applying for zoning, which they'd also have to do if they want to put in a wellness center or various other things. It doesn't have anything to do with that. And if the designation is for the exterior of the building, it doesn't mean you can't make changes inside. We have many of these stone buildings are in fact used for them. There's 2 in Canada already that have been used for spas or kind of wellness centers. So they actually become beneficial for that use. Is the protected purchaser here today or anything? Or?
Yes. Yes, she is.
Yeah.
I think she is the next speaker on our
She's the
list.
next speaker. Okay, then I can speak to her about it. I think it's really important that people who have heritage realize it doesn't stop you from doing things. I had my church designated heritage. We can actually get grants to help with the work we need to do when it's designated, so she can get some funds to help with what she has to do. And I'm sure if she likes the building the way it is, she's not going to make major changes that are going to destroy the appearance of the building anyway.
No. But it devalues the property.
The value of the property has increased significantly because it's now in the urban area. And that's the approval. I think, Councillor Shad, this is in the designated urban area now, is it not? The value of that property has probably quadrupled or something more than that because City Council made a decision, or the OMB did, that this would now be urban and not rural. That's the biggest increase in value that you could get from anything, and you didn't pay anything for that.
But if it's designated heritage, it's worth less to my mother.
It doesn't have to be. Some people pay more for heritage buildings, so it depends on who.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Kelly. Did you have a question, Councillor Carter? Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And just coming back to your point, Mrs. Kelly, In terms of renovations done in 1962, were they all internal in the house, the renovations, or were there some external also on the exterior?
No, I think apart from a new roof somewhere in the 80s, it was largely going room by room, fixing it up, fencing the property, putting the roadway, because the original property, the roadway is just on the east side of the, because Ernie Colpitts bought the balance of the property, and they were going to make a brick cement block making factory there. Unfortunately, that didn't happen because it would have been dreadful. But so my father put the roadway through the orchard because he didn't want to be responsible for that roadway with big trucks going up and down it. But yeah, it was largely internal.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly, for coming. I might use the opportunity of a moment we have before I call the next speaker just to invite Ms. Collins to offer a few observations. I should have done this earlier, but I think it would still be valuable just to give a sense of the staff perspective on this property. So, Ms. Collins?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to bring up a couple of photos of the property so that we all know what we're talking about here. Just give me 1 second. So just a very quick overview. The property is located at Fernbank Road, near the corner of Shea Road. This is a picture of the property. You may recognize it from a previous designation for 173 Huntmar Road. It's a very similar house. There is some theory, we don't know for sure, but that there were 6 houses in this area that were built by the same mason shortly after the Great Fire in the West End in the 1880s. It's a Gothic Revival stone farmhouse. So it's a representative example of its style. This is the rear, and then this is just standing back towards the rear of the property, looking towards the house. Just some of its architectural details, stone coining and decorative barge board in the eaves. This is it from standing back along the driveway. Now, this driveway is not the original alignment. But it is, the house is set back quite far from the road. This is the apple orchard that you've heard about in the motion already. Staff had initially recommended this for inclusion as a heritage attribute, but after further discussion with the prospective purchaser of the property, there was concern given the location of the orchard and the location of the house in terms of future development plans. And I'm just going to flip to a slide I have at the end that just shows you the it's kind of hard to see because the lights are up here, but the orchard is, sorry, just got to get the mouse. The orchard is here. The house is back here. So there is a plan to develop the site at some point in the future. Initially, in the short term, the house is proposed to be used as has been discussed as a wellness center for people with PTSD. The house, early indications suggest that due to a number of trees growing very close to the foundation that it may need a new foundation. So before Christmas we had some discussions with the prospective purchaser about how we could best both save the orchard or some semblance of the land use of the orchard because we are unsure of the condition or age of the trees, as well as the house, but have them be more connected to one another. So you've heard in the motion that the proposal is that should a new foundation be required based on further analysis with the new owner of the property, that it's possible that the building could potentially be moved here in order to incorporate it more closely with the orchard and retain some semblance of the green space that has always been there. And I think the prospective purchaser sees that as a good solution in terms of their proposed use of the building as well as the future subdivision and sale of the remainder of the lot for development purposes. Because as it stands right now, if these two are designated, they're disconnected from one another, and it would be a significant burden on the prospective purchaser to try and develop the site with these two pieces disconnected from one another. So that's sort of the direction that the motion went, and I just wanted to give the committee some background as to our discussion and how we got to that place. It was determined that we needed some further analysis on the orchard, and so we wouldn't include it as an attribute.
Thank you very much. Any questions from Ms. Collins? If not, we've got one more speaker, but sure, Councillor Cotter.
I'll wait till after the next speaker, Mr. Chair.
Great.
Thank you.
So why don't we pause? We'll go back to our last speaker on the list, which is Jen Hassani. Good morning and welcome. And perhaps you could clarify, I don't know if I was right in saying you are the prospective purchaser. Maybe you can clarify.
I represent a team of 7 therapists that wish to repurpose the house and use it as a wellness center. Their focus is treatment with people with concussions and PTSD, so they deal a lot with veterans and returning soldiers. They saw the house and immediately fell in love with it, despite the fact that it does need a tremendous amount of work. And so starting, I guess, in September, we started working with the current owners to look how we might make this happen for them. Their intent is really just to use the house. We don't take issue with the heritage designation, provided it applies to the exterior facade only. Provided that a couple of things that we're able to deal with the foundation issue. Further investigation has yielded that those trees that are growing out of the foundation are a couple of decades old, and their roots probably have invaded the fieldstone foundation, making it quite weak. Further, the center line of the house, the original wooden logs have cracked, and the house is actually sagging inwards, so it needs a lot of TLC. When we realized the condition of the foundation, we approached Leslie and planning to talk about, what would be involved in perhaps putting a new foundation on, because frankly, that's the best thing long-term for the house, according to our consultants. And we looked at actually connecting the orchard and the house, which I think would utilize, actually create a lot of benefits. First of all, it would connect them. Second of all, the house, which frankly can't really be seen from the road, would be visible for its first time. It would be nice for a heritage house to actually be seen by the public. And it provides a new structural stability for the house. So that's really where the therapist would like to go with this. The only other condition, and I know we've spoken and working with Leslie on this, is that because of the nature of the business, handicap accessibility is a very key component, and that we would have to look at putting some kind of extension, perhaps on the rear of the house, that mirrors the architecture nicely, so that we could make the main floor handicap accessible.
Thank you very much. Questions from committee members? Councillor Wilson.
Well, with this motion that I put forward,
yes,
that meets most of your requirements there that you were looking at then.
Yes, that's correct.
So that, in fact, designated heritage is not going to deter you in any way from taking the building, since you can do anything you want inside.
Yes, that's correct. As long as it applies to the exterior facade and allows us to also attain handicap accessibility, we're okay with it.
Yeah. And because everybody has to be handicapped, that will be allowed. There's no question about that. Okay, so I think that I'm glad to hear you say that, because you want it to be the heritage building that it is. And if we say that it's heritage, when in the future, when that area, because it is in the urban area now,
yes,
you will actually have a very valuable property.
Yes, the therapists have no particular plans to develop beyond the medical center. That's obviously not their field of expertise.
5 or 10 years' time, but you've got
perhaps when services arrive that, that'll be reassessed. But at this point, the house will be redeveloped to be a wellness center, and then it'll be left in that condition until services arrive.
Have you looked into the zoning on that, too?
Yes, as soon as we closed the purchase was delayed until we had a resolution on the heritage matters. Once we know exactly which way everything is heading on the heritage front, we plan to purchase the property and put in a submission to rezone it to LC5, which will allow a wellness center / medical facility.
Okay, I'm certainly supportive of this motion, because I think it's repurposing a building in a positive way.
Absolutely.
And I think I'm really happy that you want to use it for that purpose, because I think it'd be good for them to have the trees around them and things too.
Yes, actually, that's one of the things they loved about it was in fact the trees.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Ms. Hassani? Councillor Qadri?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Hassani, thank you for coming in this morning to do the presentation to the committee. And I also want to thank you for being persistent in terms of the usage that you're putting forward. And I think those are good uses for this particular location. The initial concerns from the representatives of the owner about the heritage designation, I do tend to agree with my council colleague that as long as the house is repurposed in a proper fashion, following some of the rules and regulations, I think it is a good use for that particular property, and I wish you all the best in that project. Having said all that, I do have one question. In terms of, you mentioned you have, I guess, 6 or 7 therapists.
That's correct.
That want to use this property for the description that you provided.
Yep.
Any idea as to the addition that you're talking about besides the handicap access? What about the other uses in terms of, or other needs for the facility, the parking, for example? How is that going to be handled? I mean, I don't want this house, once it's repurposed, to become, sit in a parking lot, for example. So how are you going to handle that going forward?
Based on, and these are initial discussions that we had, so I'll leave it at that there's no firm site plan as yet. But the original plan that we came up with at the end of December was that the house, provided that, the foundation does in fact need to be redone, the house would be relocated. Oh, perhaps you could put up that map of that. Perfect. So you can see where the arrow is moving. The intent was, and I've done some quick sketches on this, but we need a formal survey to actually get specific dimensions, is to relocate the house kind of midway through the orchard, if you will, and then tuck the parking in behind the house, so that way it's not visible from the road. We would likely, because of the age and condition of the trees, replant very similar looking species, specifically flowering trees, to emulate that look of an orchard in the front yard, and then perhaps take that driveway where it is now and move it slightly to the east, kind of tuck it in, if you will. The reason for that being is that currently that driveway is very close to the traffic circle, and people stopping to try and turn in can cause a bit of a backlog, and so we would like to move that driveway as far away from the traffic circle as we can.
Thank you for that. And just to come back to one point that you just made about the green space, you are planning on recreating that green space in some fashion agreeable to the Heritage Department?
That's correct. So in conversations with Ms. Collins, the therapists actually wish to maintain a green space around the house to maintain a very tranquil look and feel. They would like to do some kind of a patio area in the front to do kind of group meetings and the like, and have the flowering trees around that to emulate the orchard look. And again, tuck the parking in behind so it's not visible from the road. In fact, the house would become quite a showcase along Fernbank Road.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Any other questions for Ms. Hassani? Mr. Vice Chair? Okay, so we can let Ms. Hassani go then. Thank you very much for coming this morning.
Thank you.
And now we have an opportunity for questions to staff. So, Mr. Vice Chair?
Leslie, in the report that identifies the key attributes, key heritage attributes of the building and the land, there are two, and I can read this, key attributes of the setting that reflect the agricultural history of the Llewellyn Jones house include: one, its setback, approximately 90 meters from Fernbank Road, accessed by a long driveway, and to the small apple orchard at front of the property adjacent to Fernbank Road. I understand there's going to be a motion to delete the apple orchard from the designation of heritage values, but the discussion that we heard this morning is that there seems to be a maybe a very positive approach to moving the house in a different location on the property. We're dealing a lot with heritage buildings that are on wheels these days, but if the key attribute is maintained in this report, namely that a key attribute is that it's approximately 90 meters from Fernbank Road, should that not be deleted as well as deleting the apple orchard to permit the movement of the house?
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for catching that, Mr. Vice Chair. I think I think the solution could be to delete the language approximately 90 meters. Because we still, part of the discussion that we had with the prospective purchaser is that I was uncomfortable with having it, adjacent to Fernbank Road, because that's not a typical characteristic of a farmhouse in the rural area. So as we've been working on more and more of these rural turned suburban heritage designations, we're learning every time, or I guess I'm learning every time, the challenges associated with trying to preserve some of that context. So I think, in short, the answer is perhaps the motion should be amended to delete the language approximately 90 meters. And that was an oversight on my part.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilkinson?
Mr. Chair, then, if we could just add that to the, of number 4, is to delete the, what would the wording be? Delete the comments of the 90 meters, is it?
Delete the, sorry, just give me 1 second.
Maybe you could just say retain the substantial setback.
So you're really saying delete the 90 meters but retain a substantial setback is what you really want looking at, isn't it?
So we're suggesting that under number 1, you could amend number 1 to say remove the apple orchard and the distance from the road from the list of heritage attributes.
Okay.
I'd like to see it maintained back from the road.
While maintaining
A substantial.
substantial setback from the road?
So the
We don't want
new,
3 meters from the road.
no, the new attribute would read, it's setback from Fernbank Road accessed by long driveway.
Okay. So that's still in there.
Okay, any other questions for staff before we go to the motion? Councillor Carter?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I just got one very quick question with staff. As you can imagine, that because this item was delayed last meeting, there has been a lot of discussions in behind the scene with staff, as well as the proponent, as well as the property owner. So I want to first of all thank staff for doing that, participating in that discussion and making some adjustments to the recommendation. Having said that, in terms of the report, Ms. Collins, it mentions that there was a request to designate this house as heritage. There was no history given on that request, who the request came from, was it from the department, was it from somebody in the community? So if you can give us a background on that, I would appreciate that.
Sure, no problem. Through you, Mr. Chair, heritage designation requests or applications come from many sources. Some of them are staff initiated, some of them are applied for by a property owner, and then some of them come from general members of the Ottawa community. So in this instance, the application was submitted. We have an application form on our website by a member of the local community who has an interest in local history, and the application was submitted and it went on our list of properties to be assessed, and the property was for sale. So that's how it ended up in the hopper.
Thank you for that, Ms. Collins, and I'm aware how the application came in. I just didn't see a historical aspect in terms of where this application came from, so that's where the question came up on this. When that this request came in and did question the previous public delegation, were they informed of the request, and did you have conversation with the prospective owner at the not prospective owner, but the current owner?
Our process generally when we receive these applications is that until we have sort of assessed the property and determined whether or not it would merit designation and that we would be moving forward with it, we don't advise the property owner because we don't have anything to tell them at that point in time. So that's why Mrs. Jones and Mr. and Mrs. Kelly were not notified of the request that we had received. However, when the prospective purchaser came in to discuss their use of the potential use of the property, it did come up, and we still hadn't completed the work at that time. So at that time, we just told them, we've received an application, and then I followed up quite quickly. Within 2 or 3 weeks, we finished all the work and got back in touch with the current property owner to tell them that we had determined that it met the criteria for designation, and to discuss the potential designation with them.
Thank you very much, Ms. Collins, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Caudry. Any other questions for staff on this item? Seeing none, Councillor Wilkinson has introduced a motion, which she has subsequently amended so that the words read with the inclusion. Sorry, I'm just going to scroll down. It's on the screen. Remove the apple orchard and the distance from the road from the list of heritage attributes. So the amended motion is before us. Is that carried? Carried.
Mr. Chair, before you carry, I just have one small statement I'd like to make on the motion itself.
Oh, sure.
And then
now's the time.
Okay, thank you. I've had the opportunity to go to this house, I guess about a week ago, and had a good look around, not only inside the house, but outside the house, as well as this physical setting currently on the property. And I think working with staff, as I mentioned earlier, we've worked out some kinks into the process, so I'm happy to see that also. I'm also happy to see the designation of heritage being applied to this building, and I do support that. And I think here we have an opportunity not only to look at this heritage building and to protect it, but you've got a viable user that has come forth, is willing to invest in the property, is willing to upgrade the property in terms of the house itself. So I think the designation is worth it for this particular location. And I do want to once again thank staff and thank the public delegation that came out this morning to represent this file. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Caudry. So then on the main motion as amended, is that carried? Carried. And I would simply want to echo Councillor Caudry's comments. I've been spending a lot of time in Stittsville recently, this week, and just over a month ago when I went out and looked at this property initially, and I think we found a very useful and sustainable and practical solution to this problem. So thank you, Councillor Caudry, for your interest, to staff, and to the prospective buyer for all the work that went into this. So on that note, we can move to the next item, which is item number 5, the New Edinburgh Heritage Conservation District Plan. And this time I'm going to let staff go first. So
Councillor, you just a technicality, you carried the amendment. Do you have to carry the report too?
I did, yeah.
Oh, you did, so I misheard.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to further complicate this issue, which has been so nicely resolved.
Okay, so Ms. Collins, do you want to introduce this item for us? Sure.
Okay, good morning again. So this is a presentation regarding the new New Edinburgh Heritage Conservation District Plan, which we've been working on for the last year or so. So I'll just give you a brief overview of the contents of the plan. I'm not going to go through it bit by bit because it would not be very interesting for you. So in terms of background, the New Edinburgh Heritage Conservation District was designated in 2001, and at that time, the New Edinburgh Heritage Conservation District Study and Plan was adopted by Council. As you are well aware, in 2005, changes to the Ontario Heritage Act now permit municipalities to adopt HCD plans through bylaw for existing HCDs, which creates stronger protection for HCDs. And in 2014, we initiated the New Edinburgh HCD Plan project with a team of members from the community, which was a group of people from the New Edinburgh Community Alliance, as well as a member of the Board of Heritage Ottawa sat on the committee, on the working group, I should say. So the requirements of an HCD plan are laid out in the Ontario Heritage Act, and these requirements are a statement of objectives, a statement of cultural heritage value, a description of heritage attributes, policies, guidelines, and procedures for maintaining or for managing change in the district, and a description of alterations that don't require a heritage permit. So this plan has been drafted in order to meet the requirements of the Ontario Heritage Act. The boundaries of the HCD will remain unchanged. As you can see from this map, they are the boundaries of the former village of New Edinburgh. One thing that you will notice here, and has been discussed at length, I think, in reference to Rockcliffe Park, but we are moving towards a contributing and non-contributing classification for buildings. In 2001, when the building-by-building analysis was done for New Edinburgh, buildings were categorized between 1 and 4, as is typical in many of our older heritage conservation districts. Categories 1 through 3 were considered to be contributing to the Heritage Conservation District, and Category 4 were newer buildings or buildings that had been heavily altered and no longer represented the reasons for the designation of the district. So as we have done in some of our, in most of our newer districts, we have taken the categories 1 through 3 and called them contributing, and the category 4 non-contributing. And the reason for this is so that the 1 through 3 get treated the same, basically. And we've found over the years that there are often instances where a category 3 building is thought to be more disposable than a category 1 building, and in this instance everybody's on a level playing field, and it makes it easier to protect the buildings in our opinion. So the Statement of Cultural Heritage Value is the foundation of the plan, and this outlines the reasons the HCD is significant. And I think this is the most important piece, and this is the piece that we started with. So we wrote this, this Statement of Cultural Heritage Value was written in collaboration with the Community Working Group, and it was the foundation for which all management guidelines came from. So everything that is in the HCD plan in terms of guidelines is intended to protect and manage the special character of the HCD as defined by the Statement of Cultural Heritage Value. Just a quick summary of the reasons. So it's a significant example of a 19th century village located within the urban area of Ottawa. Its association with Thomas Mackay, who was a Scottish entrepreneur who constructed Rideau Hall and operated mills at Rideau Falls. And New Edinburgh was a residential neighborhood for many of his workers from the mill. And then there's a high level of architectural integrity in the village with a diverse mix of housing styles, including buildings from as early as the 1830s. And then just very, very quick excerpts from the heritage attributes: the historic block layout with streets and laneways, 1.5 to 2.5 story residential building height with a dominance of front gable roofed houses. The remaining through lots from Mackay, Crichton, and Stanley to River and Avon lanes, and significant non-residential buildings including churches such as Mackay United or St. Bartholomew's, as well as the former Crichton Street Public School, which speak to the area's former history as a self-contained village. The next section of the plan is the guidelines, which are broken down into 4 sections. So conservation guidelines for specific building elements. So the picture on the right, you can see a bad pointing job and a good pointing job in terms of masonry repointing. So there are guidelines around mortar mixes and that sort of thing. Guidelines for addition to both contributing and non-contributing buildings. Guidelines for new construction in terms of the in terms of vacant lots, or if a building is lost by fire or a non-contributing building is demolished, as well as guidelines for landscape and for the laneways. In terms of consultation, as I mentioned, the draft was written in consultation with the working group from NECA and a member of the Board of Heritage Ottawa. The first draft was published online in July. We held a public meeting in October. Approximately 30 people came to that public meeting. We did receive comments at the meeting as well as several comments after. And then the final draft was circulated to the working group in early December. They provided some further minor comments, and the draft was revised accordingly. A statutory public meeting is required under the Ontario Heritage Act, and all property owners must be notified of this meeting. We've been advised by our legal staff that Planning Committee is the appropriate place to have this statutory public meeting. So that meeting is January 26th, and all property owners have been notified of the meeting and offered the opportunity to submit comments or attend the meeting and speak. So in conclusion, the department recommends the adoption of the new Edinburgh Heritage Conservation District Plan because it meets the requirements of the Ontario Heritage Act. It's been developed in consultation with the community, and it will provide a greater level of protection for the new Edinburgh Heritage Conservation District. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Member Quinn was first off the mark. So,
Thank you. I have a question, just Leslie, if you could elaborate on the four guidelines for the fourth one for landscape and laneways, simply because in my experience on this committee we have had some contentious proposals come before us about developing laneways. So if you could elaborate on how the new guidelines have addressed that, would be appreciated.
As you say, the laneways have been a contentious issue in New Edinburgh for some time. One of the early attributes that was very clearly articulated to me from my working group was the importance of the green character of the laneways and the sort of informal character of the laneways, and that there was concern over the building of big houses on the lanes. So with that attribute in mind, there was a need to have management guidelines associated with it. So Section 8.5.6, which is page 30 of the plan, addresses the laneways. So it's fairly strongly worded. The simple green character of the lanes shall be retained. It talks about additions on buildings that back onto the lanes, that they must have regard for the lanes. So it's not just what it looks like from Crichton Street, but it's also what it looks like from River Lane. New residential development may be appropriate where there's a vacant lot or a building is demolished, but severances are not. The further severance of the long lots in the neighborhood is not something that would be supported. And then there was also some concern about new accessory buildings on the lanes and the size of them. We had an application a couple of years ago for a new garage on the lane, but it was quite large, and it was 2 stories, and there was a loft up above, and so there was concern about the fact that new accessory buildings on the lanes should reflect the character of historic accessory buildings on the lanes. So small, modest, clad in wood, that kind of thing. So that's the guidelines for laneways.
any other questions to staff? Mr. Vice Chair?
This follows on other questions on other files that have to do with the scoring of buildings and the classification into contributing and non-contributing. In section 8.5.1 of the Heritage Conservation Plan, sorry to refer to a number which people don't have quick access to, but it's a statement there that has to do with demolition and relocation that really needs to be better understood in terms of the principle involved here. For instance, what it says that in accordance with the objectives of this plan to make the retention of all buildings in the Heritage Conservation District a priority, the demolition of existing buildings, both contributing and non-contributing in the HCD, is strongly discouraged. And then it goes on to say other things. Were there any questions within the community about why we should have the wording that strongly discourages the demolition of non-contributing buildings? I think this is an educational point, which I think I'm raising, not that I'm challenging this, but I think that we need to share with the public much more clearly why we would classify buildings contributing and non-contributing, and then say if it's non-contributing, you still shouldn't demolish it.
That's a very good question. I spent, I think, the months of February and March of 2015 discussing this exact issue. The idea behind that guideline and the idea behind the objective that talks about It says, prioritize the reuse of existing buildings as an alternative to demolition, including renovation and improvement of non-contributing properties to enhance the character of the HCD. And how we got here was, after much discussion, a recognition that just regardless of age or architectural style or any of these things, there was a feeling on the part of the community that all of the buildings in their community contributed to the history of the neighborhood. So they're all a piece of the puzzle, good, bad, ugly, beautiful. They're all pieces of the puzzle. And, but at the same time, I was quite adamant with them that I was not comfortable, you know, assessing a 1990s building that might be perfectly compatible with the character of the neighborhood as contributing to the overall statement, the reasons for designation, and that's not, I could not defend, you know, not demolishing that building, which could be replaced by something also equally perfectly appropriate. So the whole basis of it is a recognition that all of these buildings have some place in the community, and that keeping them is a better alternative to demolishing them, and improving the ones that are less compatible to make them more compatible is a better alternative than demolition. And so that's where that guideline comes from. You'll see the second guideline also speaks more clearly to the demolition of contributing buildings and says that it shall not be supported. Sorry, did you have something to add?
Say that's the same.
Mr. Chair, the reason for raising that is that not wanting to introduce a rabbinical or Jesuit discourse here on the subject, but when we look at standards and guidelines for historic places in Canada, there are strong references to the idea of reinstating historic elements that have been obliterated or that are not compatible. And I think that intellectually, this statement really is not compatible with the principle and standards and guidelines of historic places in Canada. That's just something not for this discussion here today, because I don't want to extend it, but I think that this kind of dialogue should probably be the subject of a workshop where Heritage Ottawa and others participate in it, so that we get a shared vision of what these terms and what this language means and what the policies are. That's my only point in raising that.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Member Smallwood.
Just to that point, my reading of that was not that you were expecting people to recreate historic buildings, but rather the compatibility doesn't necessarily have to be architectural styles. There are many other forms of compatibility. It could be massing, it could be setbacks, it could be a variety of things. So I saw that as to say, somebody comes forward with an alternative that is more compatible for some other reason, that would be what would be preferable to creating historic reproductions of former buildings.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for staff on this item? Seeing none, I know that the Vice Chair has a much shorter amendment to the motion, very, very short, just dealing with two very specific legal or technical items. Mr. Vice Chair?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Moving that the draft motion, which I think is on the screen here, that has gone through legal staff and probably Heritage staff as well, which has to do with clarifying the language of the heritage attributes and the enforceability. And without reading it out, I would just like to move this amendment.
So as you can see, the motion just replaces two small wording changes to make sure it is legally sensical and enforceable. So I guess what we'll do is we will see if we can carry the motion as put forward by the Vice Chair. Is that carried? Okay. And then is the overall motion carried as amended? Carried? Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you very much to staff and to the New Edinburgh Community Association Working Group and to all of the people who have been involved with this. I think we'll have an opportunity at Planning Committee to hear more from the residents, so I look forward to that discussion. And if there is, or if there are any changes emerging from that meeting, I will be sure to let members of this committee know. I'm not expecting any, but we do, of course, need to be open to what happens at that meeting in terms of the public interventions. So, on that note, we can move to the next item on our agenda. I think we have a speaker. Sure. It's a little unorthodox, but please. Yeah.
I just want to say that this has been actually, we of course had many disagreements, our community, with the planning department, including Heritage specifically, and Leslie very specifically. But I just want to say that this has been a really wonderful experience in the last year working with Leslie. She's been absolutely terrific. She's been very, very responsive. We didn't have to beat her up to get her to see things our way. And so I just want to say that this was a very good example of excellent collaboration between the Community Association and planning staff.
They saw some things my way, I think.
Yeah, we gave in a bit. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming out this morning. Okay, so moving on to our next items, members will have noted under information previously distributed the short memo which captures an issue that I raised briefly at the last meeting on reviewing planning applications. Are there any notices of motion? No notice of motion. Any inquiries? I see none. Other business? No. Adjournment in that case. We're adjourned. Great. And our next meeting is Thursday, the 11th of February. So thank you very much to the members and to staff.